in HR.
Whether it's passive talent or it's active talent.
That's a soft skill that really gets undersold in the hiring process.
How to manage in the virtual environment.
You get a diverse, cultured group of people. It's a win-win for everybody.
More conversion from candidate leads.
What does that look like in this new virtual world?
Welcome, everyone. It is Thursday, noon Eastern time, and you know what that means. Welcome to Talent Experience Live. I am your host, Devin Foster, and this is your weekly look at the hot topics in HR, interviews with leaders in the industry, as well as hot new HR tech, covering everything that you need to know in recruitment, talent acquisition, as well as talent management. So since you are here, let's kick things off with where everyone is from. A colleague and friend of mine always says that he considers himself an employee of the internet. I do the same, and I love to see the power and the connection of the internet and see where everyone is joining us from. So feel free to hop into the chat. Let us know. And also, don't forget to share this to your network. Sharing is caring. We do this weekly live stream every single Thursday at noon Eastern time. So we're constantly covering topics that are pertinent to you. So don't forget to share, like, subscribe, the whole nine. I feel like a professional YouTuber when I say that, but you get the gist. And if you can't catch today's full episode, you can always find it on YouTube as well as the Phenom blog, which is phenom.com/blog. While you're there, you may see some exciting news. I know we did a nice little blog write-up from the news that Phenom announced yesterday with our next round of funding, which is constantly helping us towards our purpose, helping a billion people, that's billion with a B, find the right job. So definitely check that out and share that as well. Obviously, helping a billion people find the right job is no small task. So love to get the message out there. I'm going to take a peek at the comment section, and it looks like Jonathan is joining us from Dallas, Texas. We have somebody joining us from Reading, UK. Welcome. And Zach from Utah is joining us as well. Welcome, everyone. And boy, oh boy, do we have a very interesting and important topic to cover today. It's diversity is not a problem to solve. It is an initiative to support. Constantly, people think of diversity as how do we fix this? Where is the switch that we can flip that'll put all of our worries and sometimes nightmares to rest? And many organizations have this as a top priority, but rather than addressing it as a problem or a quick fix, like flicking a light switch, employers need to implement a strategy that supports meaningful action towards inclusion as well as equity. But before we jump into that, I mentioned hopping into the chat. If anyone's joining us now, let us know where you're from. And I always like to kick things off with a nice little icebreaker question, get the comments flowing, if you will. Since our guest today actually has a background in the music industry, I would love to know what everyone has been listening to during the pandemic over the past year. I know it always excites me to hop into my car, roll the windows down, and play music as loud as I can, like the old days on my commute into the work. My music choice, however, has been a bit more embarrassing than it may have been a year or two ago. I've found myself listening to a lot more Harry Styles and Olivia Rodrigo, which definitely isn't something that I would have predicted in 2021 or even 2020 for that sake. So I see Jen is joining us from Ambler. Welcome. And while you're answering that, as always, be sure to follow Phenom on whatever platform you're joining us, whether it be YouTube, whether it be LinkedIn. Like I said, lots of great news. And if something pops into your mind after the show or a topic that you'd like to cover, you can always reach out to us on our email, which is txl@phenompeople.com. Our DMs are open, so feel free to hit us up. I see a couple people chimed in with some music recommendations. Sonia says Earth, Wind, and Fire. Can't go wrong with the classics. And Jen says The Weeknd, which I want to know your opinion on the Super Bowl halftime, but we'll carry that on another episode. Once again, I'm Devin Foster, and today we are talking all about diversity and how it is not a problem to solve, but rather an initiative to support. And with that, we have a very special guest. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Cliff Jurkiewicz, Vice President of Strategy at Phenom, and also pilot, and musician. Let's bring on Cliff. Cliff, how are you?
Hey, Devin, how are you doing?
I'm doing well. Excited to have you on the program today. It's tradition around these parts to not only ask the icebreaker question, but also ask people how they got into the HR industry, right? We have so many different positions that people are in, whether it be HR manager, talent acquisition, somebody like you who chats with CHROs and VPs of TA and everything in between. So how did you kind of get your start into really discussing human resources? Was it something that you grew up as a child wanting to be, or did you kind of just fall into it like everyone else?
I'm not sure anyone, grows up thinking that I want an HR title, but I do think people love to be connected to other people. And when you have that passion to help others, I think there's a natural tendency to steer yourself into sort of that human capital, profession, no matter what it is. And so for me, my real journey began years ago when I owned my own company. I owned a software company for a number of years. And so you wear a lot of hats. And one of the hats was sort of that more of a HR generalist at the time, because we couldn't afford to hire HR folks until we could. I did a lot of those tasks. But, I think my entire background, which is a bit eccentric and unusual, sort of led me to this role at Phenom, where I first started with the company 5 years ago, and I was running our services area, just sort of building at the time the nascent project management implementation team, kind of building that out and build the foundation for what the team that has it now is just really crushed it in terms of the operation. But that was my first real foray into at least HR technology and understanding how broken this tech was 5 years ago, and what a need like Phenom and other companies. I mean, we're not the only one that plays in this space. We've got a lot of competition out there, and we love it. It validates what we all do. The more competitors there are, the more valid this space becomes. And so it's been very interesting peeling back the layers of HR tech and HR and talent acquisition in general, and uncovering what, it's shocking, some of the problems that we are uncovering and solving, which is really good. So that's kind of how I got into it. It was really, honestly, it was Phenom.
You gotta love that. Now you mentioned wearing a ton of different hats, and I can't help but notice the guitars hanging in your background. So I have to ask you the same question as to what have you been listening over the past year, or simply over the past few weeks?
Sure. So I'm a bit old school. So I went to school in Philly as a musician. I went to a performing arts school, and I'm a drummer. If you're curious. I do play guitar, which is the camera's funky.
It's flipped, yeah.
So I the last year I have dug a lot deeper into my standby favorite, which is Rush, Canadian progressive rock trio, and that's when you're a musician, you have a great appreciation for listening to other really great musicians. But I would say, I think there's a lot, I listen to everything, but there's a lot of really great music out there right now. I think the pandemic has given us an opportunity. If there was one of the things that is a benefit, we've been able to maybe explore some genres and some artists that we didn't make time for before. And so as an artist, I can really appreciate that because there's a lot of great music that goes unheard. And I think we're discovering a lot more, which is really interesting to me.
Yeah, no, I think everyone needs a diverse music catalog to listen to, depending on which mood you're in or how you're feeling that day. And I see the comments rolling through. We have Chelsea saying Ava Max, Rhonda saying CC Winans, and Tom Tate saying YYZ. So very exciting stuff. But obviously, this isn't around people's diverse music catalogs. It is around diversity in the workplace. And you had a lunch and learn last week, which really dawned on me with this idea of bringing you onto the show, which it's not a problem to solve, it's an initiative to support. Now, obviously that means that organizations don't have diversity issues in some way, shape, or form. But how do you understand the idea of it being an initiative to support rather than really a problem to solve? And why is that so important in wrapping your head around that thought process?
Yeah, and so one thing real quick, you're going to hear my kids in the background because I'm working at home like everyone else, 2 and a 5-year-old that have to keep occupied, so I apologize for that. On some level, I apologize. Otherwise, it's just life, right? So I think, the title of that Lunch and Learn came from something that I've been talking about for the last couple of years, as I have gotten more and more interested and educated myself around diversity, inclusion, and equity. The more folks that I talked to, the more it became apparent that they were looking at diversity and inclusion in particular as we've got this problem to solve, and it makes it sound very transactional. And I personally had a bit of an issue with that, not with the people in general, but just with the lens of that it is a problem that could be solved very easily. And then they would ask, naturally, because I work at Phenom, they would ask, okay, what from a technology perspective are you doing to support diversity and inclusion, and equity has come into the picture here, importantly come into the picture. And I really thought to myself that this isn't a problem that gets solved. It's just not. It's an initiative. It's ongoing. It lasts forever. As long as you are employing people and working with others, this is something that in your strategic thinking needs to be embedded or aligned in everything that you do. So then it does become an initiative, and it's a mindset change. When you think of it that way, that I'm not solving a problem, I'm creating an initiative. Just in that, the nature of that in itself is inclusive, and you start to think about diversity. You start to think about equity differently. It's more of a positive spin. When you call something a problem, it feels very negative. But when you call something an initiative, it's very positive, and it should be. This is something positive.
And it's an ongoing, upkeep, right? It's not something where, you think of, I'll use a car example, right? Where you run out of gas on the side of the road and all of a sudden you need to just go fill it up. This is something where you need to constantly change your tires. You need to keep your gas tank full, right? In order to keep going and keep moving forward. One thing that really jumps out at me whenever this topic of DE&I is discussed is that diversity, equity, and inclusion are always almost grouped together as a combination. Now, when you're addressing this as an initiative, do they need to be separated in some way, shape, or form, and each of them be addressed in their own ways? And is that kind of a fundamental problem as to why some people are struggling with creating initiatives towards DE&I processes?
Yeah, I think it's an important question to examine, and every organization is going to be different. So I think what I've learned is that there is no one way to create an initiative around this, or no one way to look at those three elements. In terms of, are they equal in themselves? Are they separate? Do you build different things around each of them? And I think that's going to be for organizations to determine. But for me, in my experience, diversity and inclusion are absolutely equals. And the outcome, if you're really paying attention to D&I, the outcome will be equity. So to me, it's almost like an equation: D plus I equals E. Now we say diversity, equity, and inclusion because it's a mnemonic that sounds good, right? Mm-hmm. But I think for what in my research, what I found is that D plus I equals E. So
now, over the past year or probably a few years at this point, it oftentimes has just been addressed as D&I, right? Diversity and inclusion. Now we're seeing this DE&I, and you mentioned that it's an equation, right? That diversity plus inclusion diversity plus inclusion equals equity. How does that impact equity? What are some ways and examples of how those two initiatives can really assist with the third versus trying to put them all together? How are they separate and how are they equal, I guess is my question.
Sure. Yeah. So I'll give you an example, something that I presented last week when I was talking about equity in itself. If you think about one of the more common talking points right now is the pay gap, which a pay gap absolutely exists. And there's going to be folks on both sides of that debate that are going to present different points, and they're going to say things like, well, there's a reason there's a difference between pay gap between men and women is because men work more, they don't stay home, and they're not as involved with child rearing, and they can't get pregnant, obviously, so they're not taking time off. To me, those are all almost irrelevant arguments to why someone should be paid for the work that they're doing equal to others who are being paid for similar work. But it's not just about pay, and this is where the equity piece comes in. Equity is pay, and the way that I put it in my presentation last week, it's also advancement. So you can pay individuals equally, so that's part of solving or supporting an initiative. But if you're not advancing underrepresented groups, within your organization, then the pay is just half of the equation, because the pay plus advancement is what's important. So if you're not doing both, then you're not really being diverse and you're not really being inclusive. But if we're looking at just, again, pay as the example, paying everyone fairly, and also including them in the organization, the advancement of the organization, the advancement in leadership and roles and things like that, then you are being equitable across the board in that one example. And there are tons of other examples, but for me, that's where equity becomes such an important part. It is almost the driver and and forgive the term, the equalizer in determining whether your DE&I initiative is actually working or not.
That makes sense, and it's an interesting thought, because I think if everyone is to look back at the early stages of their career and the position that they're in, if they aren't given that opportunity for advancement, that's where the pay scale really begins to differ, right? You could spend 15 years, at XYZ company and get your 3% raise annually. However, if you don't advance within your career, those big jumps will never occur, right? Those promotions, bonuses, things along those lines. When it comes to that thought processes, what are some strategies that companies should implement in order to not only just support DE&I, but also that portion of advancement that you just mentioned? Are there anything that you heard that has been very successful?
Yeah, so a couple of things that I think are really important. The first is, again, I'm going to paint a mental approach to looking at DE&I, and that is something I've been talking about for a number of years. Well before this started to really take a good foothold in our culture, and that is the idea of attraction versus promotion. And attraction is, and it's something that we talk about at Phenom regularly, not only to clients, but to internally to all of our team members and the people that we work with. And that is, how do you build a culture in an organization that attracts diversity? Open arms, welcomes it, says, come be a part of who we are, versus promotion. I'm not saying promotion is a bad thing. Saying that you're diverse doesn't make you diverse. Saying that you want to, have X percentage of diversity doesn't make you diverse. It's great to start there. It's sort of admitting that, that there is an inequity in your organization, and we'd like to, create an initiative around it, but it doesn't necessarily get you moving in the right direction. But attraction does. Attraction is something that, you're not self-promoting, and I mean self-promoting at the organizational level. by saying we're diverse or we want this or we have that. It is by the nature of your actions, by the makeup of your organization and the outreach to the communities that you serve. By nature, those things will be broadcast. So it becomes a grapevine, whisper down the lane, a word of mouth. And it's something that we've experienced here at Phenom. I can proudly say that we are the most diverse company I have ever worked in, period. And that comes from the leadership of our company. And we work with a lot of great companies that are doing similar things in order to attract talent, to say that there's no question that you, and I think of, I use GoDaddy as an example, and what you think of GoDaddy as a product or service company is certainly your opinion, but they were one of the very first companies to start broadcasting what their diversity and inclusion makeup looked like. And they do a report every year, and they publish 10 different metrics on themselves, and they self-report. And what that says is, we're willing to share where we need to do more work. And maybe you would like to be a part of helping us change that. So that's a big piece of attraction, is sort of the intelligence or reporting of how are we doing, admitting to the world, where you are doing well and where you are falling short, and where you need help in doing that. So that's certainly one area among many. The other one that I think is worth mentioning, because we all know about ERGs, employee resource groups, and they are a great resource, but they are being underutilized. And this is what I heard consistently from 150 plus leaders that I talked to, especially about their ERG programs, is that they, admittedly, many of them say we haven't given them enough responsibility. We haven't embedded them in each area of our business to help them identify where we are falling short or where we're doing well, or doing things like more community outreach and representing the company and the diversity and inclusiveness of a company, outside of its organization. And the other piece, as it pertains to the world that we live in, Devin, with talent acquisition, being able to use ERGs to validate things like your candidate screening processes, even your job descriptions, looking at things for the bias, and certainly we'll talk about unconscious bias here in a minute. But being able to leverage employee resource groups in different ways, and a lot of it has to do with hands-on, pretty tough work. But in most cases, they're willing to do it, and if you let them, they will make your organization better, hands down. You just have to give them the autonomy to do it.
There's a lot of great points there, and the one that really stood out to me was that the GoDaddy example, where they almost look themselves in the mirror and say, hey, where can we improve? And that's not just on a team level or an individual level, it's on an organizational level, and then they broadcast it out to the world. The other thing that you mentioned there was ERGs. And one thing, whenever I have a recruiter on this show and we talk about university recruiting in the past year and how it's changed, I always ask them specifically around if they've changed their strategies to the schools that they typically go to. I know when I was a university recruiter, I went to my University of North Carolina, I went to Duke, I went to this, that, the other thing. And those schools typically don't play nice. They'll schedule career fairs on the same day, and you can't be in two places at once. But with the pandemic and everything being virtual, I always ask them, have you changed that strategy at all? Have you, began to recruit at historically Black colleges and universities? Have you began to go to women-only schools? And oftentimes the answer is no, which is difficult, especially if you are implementing those employee resource groups and those opportunities within your organization. You really have to not just say, hey, we have diversity. It's the actions that go along with it and what you're portraying there. You touched on unconscious bias there, and I think that is a very sensitive topic for a lot of people. Almost people get offended by it, right? I'm not biased. I've never been biased, but unconscious bias is something that is within all of us, whether we like it or not. So my question to you is, what kind of is the root cause of that? Number one, our idea that no one ever wants to admit that they have any bias. I'll admit right now to you, Cliff, I'm biased against Patriots fans, and that's because I'm a Jets fan. But when it comes to talent acquisition and things like that, no one ever wants to admit their biases. So where does it come from, and what's the root cause of it?
Yeah, and I'm sorry you're a Jets fan. I'm a born and bred Patriots fan, so we'll have to have that argument another day.
Exactly.
It's as human beings, it is very difficult to admit that we're wrong about something, especially when the evidence of that error isn't so evident. But where does unconscious bias come from is a very easy question to answer, but it's very hard sometimes to digest. It comes from the world around us and what we've learned. Everything that we've seen from the moment we're able to look, and if we can speak, to be able to speak, if we can move, to be able to move around. But whatever physical interaction we're having with the world around us, the second that we can start to ingest that, whether we remember it or not, our brain is storing every little thing that we do. And to give you an idea of, and I absolutely have unconscious biases, and we'll talk about, I'll save that for, in a few minutes, we'll talk about how we uncover them. But the idea is very simple to understand. Your brain can only process about 40 things to make a decision at any moment. So if you're asked to do something, or you're driving a car, which direction I'm going to go, you can think of about 40 things, 40 conscious things, but your brain is processing about 11 million. And so if you look at all the things that you've learned in life, everything that you've ever done, the overwhelming majority of your thoughts will be biased. You just don't know it. And these are just natural reactions to things that we've learned over, millennia of being human beings. We're born and bred into it. But one of the things that's sort of an unconscious bias for a lot of people, it sounds weird, but it's a good example, is if you watch watch a viral video of someone standing at the top of a 100-story building, dangling their feet off the edge, looking down, you get a feeling of vertigo. And that's because unconsciously you have a fear that has been bred into you for literally the lifespan of being a human being. For the first probably, 60, 70,000 years of us being human and walking, you think back to who was the first human being that walked off the edge of a cliff because they didn't know what was down there. Had no idea, just didn't know, just fell, and it was just like, okay, I'm falling, right? But you do that millions of times with millions of people over 10, 20, 30, 40, 50,000 years, and you get this bias, that's built into you. And that's just one example. You can go through dozens of examples that pertain to diversity and inclusion. And I can give you one. I can help you paint a picture of what your bias would be. If I said to you, picture a garbage delivery person, what are you going to see? You're probably going to see, a male. You're probably not going to see a female. And that's an unconscious bias because your environment around you, every time you see the waste disposal folks coming around, they're probably men. But there are plenty of women that work in that industry. There are plenty of women truck drivers. There are plenty of women, garbage persons, so, you just don't picture it because you have a natural unconscious bias already built into you. And think if that plays out in every decision that you make, it's going to play out. And you have to consciously ask yourself, about the decisions and how I came to that decision.
That's interesting. Number one, you mentioned you can only, focus on 40 things at once. And immediately I think of driving down the road, whether it be my commute or, going to a Jets game, unfortunately. And you get in that mode where you kind of don't know what happened the past 10 miles. You've been functioning and driving, but your mind is elsewhere, right? You're focused on other things and you're just in almost autopilot, if you will. And then you bring up that fact of what we think of, a certain employee looks like. And my next question for you is, when hiring managers are often hiring for positions, let's say to replace an employee, let's say Devin is leaving the marketing team and a hiring manager goes to the recruiter and says, hey, I need somebody who is exactly like Devin. He did a great job. He's moving up within the organization. How can we fill that role? Does that play into the unconscious bias there where somebody has, in this case, a male who has a college degree, when it comes into the recruiting process, and is that something to combat along the way?
It does, and this is where we get into a bit of an argument, or let's call it spirited discussion around what does succession planning look like? And there's always been some outspoken individuals on things like should we be replacing someone who might not be as qualified, but they fit into that underrepresented group. It could be women, could be someone who's Black or Asian or Indian, whomever it might be. But Devin's a white guy. Is this an opportunity, to add some diversity to the team? Is that the priority? Even if that person might not be as highly skilled as Devin was. Or didn't show all of the potential that Devin did when he got the job. And so there is this unconscious bias that when I chose Devin, or when Devin was put into that job, here are all the attributes and skills and all the things that I looked for, and it turned out great. He did awesome. He's moving on to bigger and better things. So let's find that exact same makeup, because we know that it works. And so and for me, I say, that's the wrong way to look at it. And I don't think it's necessarily important, as important, let me put it that way, to fill the role with someone who has the same skills as the person who is leaving, or who had the same skills as the person, who's leaving was brought on, when they got the role. I think DE&I, is really an opportunity. So if Devin's leaving, let's look at the spectrum of who we've got. And I would pose a question, and I pose this question to leaders all over the world, who have said to me, we only want to give the job to the most highly qualified person. And so it's a chicken and egg conversation. It is, how are individuals that are underrepresented supposed to get the skills if you don't give them the opportunity, and don't give many of them the opportunity to prove that they can do as good, or even in a lot of cases, a better job than someone who fits into a privileged community. And the response is usually silence, because they don't look at it that way. They just like, I have a business. I want to give the business the best opportunity. And the best opportunity is to do what I've done in the past, because I have evidence that it works. And so that's really the challenge, is we have to change the way that we think. And we have to change the way that, that we behave. And so to me, when Devin leaves, it is an opportunity to say, let's be a little bit more diverse in our thinking. And let's give someone who may not have, the same skill set, but has shown some initiative and can probably do the job, but they're coming from an underrepresented community. And we need to do better. We need to give those communities of people the same opportunity. And the only way to do that is to take a chance. You just have to.
100%. A lot of talk around diversity, equity, inclusion isn't just around racial profiles or education. It's also diversity of thought, right? And that mindset. So if you do bring somebody in who's able to gain those skills, provided that you have a fostering environment for them and really help them grow, it's going to change the outlook of maybe how you operate and how you do some things. In most cases, it sounds like for the better, based upon some of the statistics that I've read, where diverse teams outperform teams that have less diversity in them. Cliff, oftentimes DE&I, when it's looked at as a problem, as we stated at the top, and again, if anyone has any questions for Cliff, feel free to drop them into the chat. But when we talk about it as a problem, oftentimes people just want to buy technology to fix it. And the example that always pops into my head is workout apps that are on phones, right? It's like, I'm going to download this app and it's going to immediately put me in the best shape of my life. That's not the case. You then have to go to the gym every morning, wake up and go run, whatever it may be. The same thing I feel applies to this diversity and equity and inclusion initiatives, where it needs to have some backing by the people using it. There's certainly tools that can help. What are some examples of some of these tools? And also, how are humans at the end of the day responsible for the success of these initiatives?
So, technology really needs to play, second chair to the human part of this. If we're talking about creating, diverse, inclusive, and equitable cultures, because that's really what this is about, and then the rest follows in the workplace, that's the goal, then technology is not the driver of that, and it never should be. The second that you put it in technology's hands, you are creating a bias, and the bias will be whatever that technology is telling you to do, you're doing, and you're forgetting that you're actually a human being with thoughts, interconnecting with other human beings with thoughts, and wants and needs, and all of the things that make us human. So we need to be at the forefront. And that's why, we talked earlier about ERGs, but it's everything about DE&I, speaks to what you just said. If you look at companies that really embrace diversity and inclusion and have really good, even if they're nascent programs around, creating an equitable environment, and creating more opportunity, for the underrepresented communities that they have access to, they absolutely 100% perform better. Every study in the world has said that. Every single one. Every study has also said that they're more innovative. Every study has also said that talent will stay longer at a company that takes DE&I seriously. So there, to the converse of that, there is not a single study, and people have researched this and have tried very, very hard to prove that diversity doesn't work. And I dare you to try to find a credible study that shows you that result. There isn't one. So the question then becomes, why aren't companies doing this? Or why, to your question, why are they looking for technology to solve this problem? And the answer is because it's easy. Because if I'm a CHRO and a CIO, and we know that we've got a diversity, inclusion, and an equity imbalance within an organization, if we buy a piece of technology, report that to the public, report it to our board, report it to our employees, then it looks, on the surface, it looks like we've solved the problem. Like, great, you've got this new technological solution that's going to solve your problem, which is exactly why I don't call it a problem, because it doesn't solve anything. So where technology really is best used in supporting these initiatives is in not only the predictive nature of some of the technologies with machine learning to say, here's where you are today, here's the community that you have access to, right? And I used Philly in my presentation, I used Philly as an example. And Philly is predominantly, an African-American or Black community. And if you look at the largest companies in Philadelphia, the representation from the Black community in those companies is far exceeded by the white community. And to me, that's wrong, right? Now that doesn't, and I don't want to speak bad about any of those companies, because a lot of them do have initiatives and outreach going on right now. They're not doing a very good job of it, frankly. DE&I initiatives are not hard to support. But it does, to your point of working out, you got to show up every day. You got to be involved. And as I like to say, presence is a present. So if you are there in that moment and you're working towards that goal, if that is a primary goal of the organization, then it will change. If it's not a primary goal of the organization, if it's just, a pet project that they're kind of funding and kind of paying attention to, that's the result you get, right? So it's incredibly important that you start with the community that you're serving, right? And know the demographic of that community and make sure that your goal is to equalize the internal population of your organization to the community that it is serving, because then that's a great place to start, so that you know that you are truly being equitable in the community that you're doing business in. So for me, technology can help you report on all that. It can give you intelligence. It can give you a communication method to be able to attract the talent that you want. And for individuals, that technology can help them self-promote, because that's an enormous problem with DE&I, is as we talked about earlier, the ability to self-promote for those underrepresented communities. So technology can help with all of those things, but the driver is the human being, and it is leadership. It is leadership in these organizations that are failing their companies, and they're literally holding back the evolution and the scalability and growth of their companies by not embracing diversity, inclusion, and equity as its most important initiative. It is as equally important as building out your product or service.
That's a powerful statement, and I completely agree. And you mentioned there a metric to look at, which is where your organization is based out of, or where they call their headquarters or their satellite office, if you will. But when organizations are beginning these initiatives, what are some other key metrics that they should track or even maintain as they're advancing these processes and trying to become more diverse, inclusive, as well as providing equity?
One of the ones that gets missed pretty regularly is being WCAG compliant. Now, WCAG, WCAG, is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. This is the component or mechanism by which those that are differently enabled, they might have a hearing impairment or vision impairment or cognitive impairment, whatever it might be, making sure that all of your digital properties are compliant with the WCAG standard. And by doing that, what you're saying is, and I'll give you an example of what we do here at Phenom. We talk about getting 1 billion people the right job. And we take that, that is our only mission, on this planet, is to get 1 billion people the right job. And what we're not saying there is getting 1 billion able-bodied people the right job, right? Because no one would ever say that, and no one would ever think it. But, people do, and we talk to clients all the time who don't even understand the WCAG standard. And it is important because there are those that might not have, a diversity issue in terms of how we think of it. And again, that's an unconscious bias. When you think about diversity, you're thinking, okay, someone who's black, brown, white, whatever, that's what you think diversity starts to look like, but it's not. We're all different kinds of people, and those that are differently enabled, we have to equalize that opportunity. And so WCAG compliance is really important. I think the second is and I touched on this a little bit without going too deep, but it is the allocation of funding that you're putting towards these types of initiatives. It is great to have an ERG program, but if you're not funding it, if you're not allocating a significant amount of money so that those individuals can either take some time off, do some community outreach, work internally to help build awareness and promote the purpose of the ERG, that's where that self-promotion becomes really important. Then all you're doing is providing, some lip service, to the initiative, but you've got to back it up with the dollars behind it. And then you have to make sure that it's spent. There needs to be accountability from the ERGs, as well as leadership to ensure that money is being spent and being spent, to the betterment of diversity, inclusion, and equity within the organization. So I think those two, there's a number of other things, but those two as measures of success are what I heard across the board from the leaders that I've been talking to over the last year.
I love that you mentioned WCAG there and accessibility. And the reason for that is I oftentimes, associate things that we almost take for granted every day in our daily lives. If we, travel to our local supermarket or mega store or whatever it may be, the automatic doors that we walk through were designed for people with accessibility issues, right, to overcome them. But it's something that we all can benefit from. And diversity, equity, and inclusion, when you look at it from an organizational standpoint, is exactly the same, where we mentioned that DE&I and E are always going to make companies more profitable. They're going to be more creative. They're going to be really more productive as a whole, and help everyone involved, not just those who these initiatives or actions were designed for. And that's something that I think we should all, if there's one piece, take with us as we leave. Now, Cliff, having you on the show, you mentioned before, presence is a present. It was certainly a gift to have you on the show today. This is spectacular. I loved always chatting with you. I feel like I learn 1,000 things. When it comes to your lunch and learns, I know you covered this topic last week. Do you have any topics coming up, and how can people join or really find out more about it?
Yeah, so I do. I think it's April 27th. I've got I'm taking a little bit of a DE&I break for a moment and talking about technology, and it is a lunch and learn called Point to Platform. And the whole idea of it is, how do you buy TA technology? Is it best to buy a point solution, or best to look at a platform, and have a more holistic approach? But the whole idea is I like to teach people to stop chasing what I call the shiny red ball, or I call it shiny red ball syndrome, which is the brand new toy that comes out and I've got to have it, but you don't really know what you're buying. It doesn't make the toy bad, right? Or the shiny red ball a bad thing, but it is a mental attitude towards technology that I'm trying to change, because I see a lot of diversity of thought in technology to bring the two things together. But yeah, we're going to talk about that on April 27th. I think that's at noon. And, and I believe that is invitation only, but you can reach out to Phenom through the site and get an invitation to that.
All right. Awesome. Well, Cliff, thank you so much for joining us. I am going to try and resist the shining red ball when I walk through the stores this weekend and look for things to pick out for myself. But it's always a pleasure having you on. Thank you for discussing DE&I. It's a super important topic. If you have any questions for myself or for Cliff, you can always reach out to us at txl@phenom.com. Cliff, I wish you the best. I know you're a busy guy. Hopefully we can do this again in person in the office at some point when things return to normal. But in the meantime, be safe, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you, Devin.
Thank you. Well, there you have it. That was Cliff with everything that you need to know around DE&I and how it isn't a problem to solve, but rather an initiative to support. If any questions pop in your head later today or down the line, like I said, you can always reach out to us at TXL at phenompeople.com. Also, if you missed any little bits of the episodes here and there, you can find the recap at the Phenom blog, which is phenom.com/blog. We have some other exciting news there, like our last round of funding, helping us move towards our purpose of helping 1 billion people find the right job, which Cliff mentioned is the only reason that Phenom exists as an organization. Or you can always catch the recap on our YouTube channel. While you're there, don't forget to like, subscribe. Sharing is caring, so always share it out to your network. Before we leave, I do want to highlight last week's episode, which was one of my favorites, of course, next to this one with Cliff, which was all around reversing remote work burnout and insights from a Gallup study. Remote work burnout comes from much more than just long hours, as I'm sure we can all recognize at this point. In fact, it oftentimes stems from employees experiencing a sense of failure, feeling unseen, unclear communication from managers, unreasonable time pressures, and much more, as Gallup research shows. We have a clip now where they dive a bit more into the numbers. Let's air the clip now.
This is something we've been measuring for a while, and I think it's been really interesting to actually track what's happened through this last year and the extra, perhaps emotional, psychological stress. A lot of people are balancing many things, so we're feeling different kinds of pressures that seem to amplify some of those things we were already starting to see before COVID hit. So that's just interesting context as we look at the data that Ben's pulled up here.
obviously the most dramatic shift we saw was just employee well-being absolutely plummeting. We haven't seen levels this low since the Great Recession, and I don't think we've ever seen a drop this sharp so fast. Another data point to look at is how people's stress and worry were affected on a daily basis, so their daily emotions. We saw a huge spike in stress and worry when COVID really hit and people shifted, many of us working from home. This elevated level of stress and worry was sustained throughout 2020, so it became chronic. And stress and worry can be coped with, but when they become constant, that starts to affect the way we feel, act, behave, and starts to create some health problems. Now, on the flip side of things, if we look at employee engagement, this was a bit of a surprising, but a good surprise to us. Employee engagement remained relatively steady at a macro level. 2020, we ended the year actually with 36% of people being engaged. So it really kind of stayed on trend. As we entered the pandemic, they expected employee engagement to plummet along with well-being, because typically those two things move together. They're kind of hand in hand. When you have good well-being, it's easier to be engaged. When you're engaged, you tend to have higher well-being. So you have this scenario we're calling the well-being engagement paradox, where you have well-being being pulled down dramatically while employee engagement is kind of floating in the other direction, which is unusual. And that's really a recipe for burnout.
That was Jillian Anderson and Dr. Ben Widgert talking about employee burnout, both from Gallup. They have a report coming out in the coming weeks all around employee burnout. But if you can't wait for the report to come out, you can always catch the replay on our YouTube or our blog. Don't forget to like and subscribe while you're there. I think that makes it 6 times that I've said this on this episode. So definitely paid the bills. Special thank you to everyone who hopped into the chat. Jen, thank you, Syed. Thank you, Tom. Thank you, Mary, even though she's a Pats fan. Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, LinkedIn user from Reading. This has been spectacular. I really appreciate everyone joining us. We will be here again next Thursday. We'll be chatting with Derek from KinderCare. So a very exciting topic then as well. In the meantime, I hope everyone stays safe, stays healthy, has a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you next Thursday at noon. Thanks.